Okay, so we'll start. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to finally see you all. These are very difficult times for all of us. I'm sure some of us have either lost or know someone who lost a loved one in the October 7 massacre or in the battles that followed and are still ongoing in Gaza or along the border with Lebanon. We all anxiously wait for the return of our fellow Israelis who are still held hostage by Hamas in Gaza, including today as we follow the events unravel. And we all pray for the safe return of our sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, partners, friends who are still out there fighting Hamas and Hezbollah to ensure that Israelis can go back home and live their normal lives. As you all know, our annual conference was supposed to take place on October 11th and was canceled, of course. So we haven't met for over 4 months, and therefore nearly 5, and therefore we've decided to open our second year now. First, so that we can come together as a scientific community and renew our contacts and see everybody. And second, since we're not just any scientific community, we are a community of intelligence scholars, we have an important role, I would say, these days. We will all have to try to explain to ourselves, to the academic community, to the intelligence community, to the Israelis for generations to come, why and how did this happen to us, and what can we do better to make sure that this doesn't happen to us again. And in order to help us start grapple with these questions, we have with us today a special guest. But before I introduce her, I would like to invite Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kupavas, who came up with the idea for our forum and whose Institute for the Research of the Methodology of Intelligence is sponsoring our activity, to say a few words. So Yossi, the floor is yours. Try to keep it short so that we can have enough time.
Be very short because I'm also very eager to listen to Amy and not to keep her waiting. Just one thing, Ofek spoke about why it happened to us, and we have to look at two aspects of that. One is why Hamas decided to do it. That's a big question mark, and I'm not sure that they anticipated what happened after what they did. And the other thing is, what can we do better in order to avoid such things in the future? It's already happened. We cannot bring what happened back. We cannot reverse it. It happened, but we have to learn what happened in order to make sure that even though it repeats so often, these big mistakes of the intelligence, that we still need to see some improvement curve, and not always happens. Doesn't always happen. So I think that our choice to listen to Amy Zegart on this issue of surprises is beyond just what happened on the 7th of October, but what can we learn from other surprises and from 7th of October so that intelligence will be better in coping with this challenge of predicting what's going to happen and giving them the early warning on time. And we should continue looking into this method during the year and in the institute and in the Filam, as we call it, the IFIS organization that we have helped construct. And I'm really waiting to listen to Amy Zegart. Please, Ofek.
Okay, so yeah, building on following up on what people just said, the coming year will naturally be dedicated to a large extent to the events of October 7 and the lessons learned for intelligence. And our first guest for this year is Amy Zegart, Professor of Political Science at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Instituttion. Professor Zegart served on the Clinton administration's National Security Council staff and as a foreign policy advisor to the Bush 2000 presidential campaign. Professor Zegart is an internationally recognized expert in U.S. intelligence, emerging technologies, and global political risk management. She's the author of 5 books. The most recent one is Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, The History and the Future of American Intelligence, published in 2022 by Princeton University. So, Professor Zegart, thanks again for joining us on such a short notice. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing you and for the discussion.
Well, thank you, Ofek, and thank you all so much for having me. I am so heartbroken. I was mentioning, but as we were coming onto the Zoom, I'm so horrified. What has happened to your country. I want you to know our thoughts and prayers are with you. You know, your American friends are with you. If there's anything I can do to be more helpful as you move forward, as you investigate and try to grapple with what's happened and how to prevent something like this in the future, I'm happy to do anything I can to help. I just a little bit of background, as you know, I am not at all an expert on Israeli intelligence. I have spent my whole career looking at American intelligence, and particularly American intelligence failures. I started teaching about 9/11 on 9/11. So, 20 years later, I have taught about 9/11. That has been a very strong focus of my career, looking at what happened and why intelligence agencies failed in that instance. And I'm so inspired and amazed and impressed by your ability to have this forum here in the midst of a war, because in 9/11, it wasn't an ongoing war. We didn't have hostages, right? It was, is a very, in some ways, a much easier scenario. But I learned something really from my students on 9/11. We didn't know what to do, I'm sure, and so I just went to campus, and I can picture it 20 years later like it was yesterday. And what I learned from my students, and people were crying, and it was, we thought there were more attacks coming. And what I learned from them is that we didn't have answers as scholars. We just had questions. And in those early days, the questions were enough, because learning together, grappling with the questions together was an act of community, and it was an act of healing, and it helped us get through the trauma of that day. And it also set the stage for understanding intellectually what went wrong to try to fix it. So I applaud your efforts. It is, I'm sure it is raw. You have all lost people. You have friends and loved ones still in harm's way every day, but it is not too soon to start to work toward understanding what went wrong. I'll say one other thing about that, which is I started researching my book about 9/11 intelligence failures the night of 9/11. And I think had I waited to start that research, I would not have discovered the things that I did, because people were so anguished over the government failure. They were willing to share information with an outsider that I think they wouldn't have been willing to share later on. So I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. And Ofek asked me to talk a little bit about learning from history, and I'll share the American case, and then we can go wherever you want the conversation to go. I want this to be useful to all of you. So I know you saw I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, and I'm not going to go over that. I've done some thinking since then, where I'm happy to go over it if you want to in discussion. But I wanted to start by sharing why I think September 11th is not a good lesson, not a good analogy for Israel to learn from in this instance. And it may be counterintuitive. And I think there are three reasons why 9/11 is actually not a useful historical example of intelligence failure. The first is size. Size matters. You know this better than I do, right? Israel has a handful of major intelligence agencies. The US has 18 intelligence agencies. And before 9/11, we had about a dozen. And with that many agencies, the principal challenge in American intelligence, it was the challenge in Pearl Harbor, it was the challenge in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the challenge on 9/11, and it is a continuing challenge today. The principal challenge of American intelligence is coordination, right? Too many agencies to coordinate, too many conflicting jurisdictions. The FBI, unlike Shin Bet, right? Law enforcement and intelligence in the same organization. Those missions do not sit well together. And so I think the size issue is different, right? You have fewer agencies, the coordination is better, and there's a geographic difference too, right? George W. Bush joked when he went to Israel, as he looked at how narrow the border was across the country, said in Texas, we have driveways longer than that, right? So the geographic size of the United States adds the coordination challenge, and you have a much different challenges, right? Being small as opposed to being large. So, so when you look at intelligence fixes to intelligence failures, they're almost always in the United States to solve coordination challenges, right? The Central Intelligence Agency is called the Central Intelligence Agency because it was designed to centralize intelligence after Pearl Harbor. And it never was able to do that particularly well. And we can talk about that. So that's reason one. Reason two is what I call the white swan versus the black swan problem. 9/11 was a black swan, right? The 9/11 Commission called it a failure of imagination. It was principally the inability of our intelligence community to adapt from a completely different threat landscape, the Cold War, to a new threat landscape dominated by terrorism. And so that was really an unforeseen kind of, well, at least the 9/11 Commission said it was unforeseen. My evidence suggests the intelligence community identified it and couldn't get the reforms that it needed. October 7th was a white swan event. It was exactly the kind of disaster scenario that intelligence is supposed to anticipate and warn about. This wasn't some unknown threat, right? These were the terrorists living next door, right? So that's a difference number two, which leads to the third difference. The organizational demands in intelligence on 9/11, I think, are different than what you're confronting today. For at least the CIA and the FBI, which are the agencies of the IC that I look at the most, the challenge in the 1990s was to do a different job. Israeli intelligence agencies, the challenge is to do the old job better. That's really a different challenge, right? So I'll give you two examples just to bring this to life a little bit. And I talked a little bit about one of them in the foreign affairs piece. We now know that 18 months before 9/11, the CIA actually was watching suspected al-Qaeda terrorists meeting in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, what one intelligence official described to me as the al-Qaeda convention, right? So they're surveilling this meeting. The agency identifies some of the participants. They know that they get the full name of at least one of the participants of this meeting, Khalid al-Mihdhar, who flew American Airlines 77 into the Pentagon. And they find out he has a US visa, multiple entry visa in his passport, right? And then they find out that a second member of the al-Qaeda convention, Nawaf al-Hazmi, also who flew American Airlines 77, likely entered the United States. And yet for more than a year, no one in the Central Intelligence Agency told the FBI or the State Department to watch list these two suspected terrorists, potentially deny them entry into the country. And the question was why, right? More than 50 people in the CIA at all levels of the organization had information about these two terrorists. And the simplest answer why they didn't watch list them before 9/11 was the agency had never been in the habit of watch listing before. In the Cold War, there was no need to identify dangerous terrorists and warn other government agencies about them before they entered the country. Cold War habits, Cold War thinking, Cold War priorities, Cold War orientation, they needed to do a different job. Same thing with the FBI, right? So the FBI historically, as you know, a law enforcement organization, very difficult to transform to a domestic intelligence organization. And that explains why when they finally did learn about these two terrorists in the United States, days before 9/11, the FBI did not launch a useful effort to find them in time. The manhunt they launched for them was not nationwide. It was assigned to one office. It was given the lowest priority in the Bureau. And it was given to a rookie agent who had just finished his first year and had never done that kind of an investigation before. This is the manhunt for Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. Why did they mess up so badly? It wasn't that anybody made a mistake. It was that the FBI operated as it usually had, with a law enforcement orientation. where convicting people for crimes that had already occurred always took higher priority over catching possible future terrorists and stopping them before it was too late. So low level of priority, giving it to the most inexperienced guy on the team, those were natural approaches, right, for the FBI structure, its culture, its incentives, because it was designed for a law enforcement mission primarily. So it had to do a different job, right? So very different situation, I think, than 9/11 situation. So if 9/11 is not a useful historical example to learn lessons, what are useful historical examples? And let me just suggest, and then I'll turn it over for discussion, that I think there are 5 sets of enduring sources of intelligence failure, at least using the US as my primary point of departure. The first set of sources of intelligence failure, and you all know this well as intelligence scholars and former practitioners, it's a hard business. People often forget it's a really hard business. We are terrible at predicting our own intentions, right? I do an exercise with my students where I say I want them to predict their next vacation a year from now, what they're going to do and where they're going to go and who they're going to do it with. And imagine we're going to unfold their pieces of paper where they write down what their plans are. And I ask them how many of them actually did what they said they were going to do. And almost none of them raised their hands, right? We're terrible at predicting ourselves, even when we have the best information about our own intentions, preferences, and capabilities. That's the best intelligence case. And then, of course, adversaries try to deceive us to keep us from understanding what it is we're trying to do. So I tell my students, now imagine the person sitting next to you is the person you need to predict what they're going to do on their vacation. And now imagine they're trying to deceive you, right? We've all, you know this, but most people often forget that it's a hard business. I would add one other part to that, beyond the signals to noise and deception and the nature of intelligence, which is, I think, success can look like failure and failure can look like success. And that makes it even more challenging from an outsider perspective, trying to understand what went wrong. What do I mean? So successes can look like failure. So if intelligence, so let's say before Russia invaded Ukraine, we know that US intelligence declassified an unprecedented amount of intelligence about Russia's troop movements, right? Detailed, persistent declassification of intelligence. Let's imagine that Putin had decided, the gig is up. The Americans know what I'm doing. I'm going to change my mind. I'm not going to invade Ukraine. It would be considered still an intelligence failure. CIA warns Putin's going to invade Ukraine. He doesn't invade Ukraine. Look, there they go again, Iraq WMD. It's an intelligence failure. When it actually would have been an intelligence success. Warning led to policy decisions, in this case by an adversary, and we had a different outcome. So I think we need to be careful. And the flip side is also true. Failure can look like success, right? So failure at one point in time can be success later on. So that's this first basket of issues. It's a hard business for a variety of reasons that you all study and know well. The second enduring sources of intelligence failure are individual screw-ups. And here I think that's where the press tends to focus, who got what wrong, right? Whether it's a leader, whether it's an intelligence analyst, I think it is the least useful analytic category. For major intelligence failures, one person screwing up is unlikely to be the root cause. It's multiple people making mistakes. And when multiple people make mistakes, there are usually more systematic causes at play. So, but that second basket is usually that individual screw-ups is where the narrative naturally goes, because people want to find accountability. They want to take comfort that if only a different person had that job, everything would have been okay. And so I found this a lot after 9/11. The dominant narrative after 9/11 was, take your pick. George Bush was to blame. Bill Clinton was to blame. CIA Director George Tenet was to blame. And that was not the root cause of our intelligence failure that led to 9/11. So that's the second set of issues. The third enduring sources are collection gaps. Some of these are systematic collection gaps, and I think we don't pay enough attention to how they can be systematic collection gaps. So I'll give you an example of that. Ukraine was both an intelligence success for the United States and an intelligence failure at the same time, right? So our intelligence community warned rightly of Putin's intentions, but what did we get wrong? We assumed that the Russians would roll right through Ukraine. We evacuated our embassy in Kyiv. So confident were we in our assessment that this would be a lightning strike and the Ukrainians would never be able to last, right? Dead wrong, right? Why did we get that wrong? Systematic collection failure in part, because we counted too much on things that could be counted. Tanks, hard metrics of military power, numbers of troops, weapons capabilities. We counted of things, hard metrics, which is, an easier thing to do. And what did we systematically not count? Squishy variables like will to fight of the Ukrainians or corruption among the Russian military. So that to me is a systematic collection failure that led to our misestimation of Ukraine and its ability to fight back. In Iraq WMD, we had widespread collection weaknesses, particularly when the weapons inspectors were kicked out. So, sometimes it's systematic failures, sometimes it's more widespread or not so systematic. So that's the third basket. So it's a hard business, individual screw-ups, collection failures. The fourth basket of issues, and I know you studied this well, analytic bias, right? And there are a whole bunch of analytic biases. I have in my book, I call them the 7 deadly biases. The 7 biases I think are most often at stake, at least in looking at the history of US intelligence failures. And I'll just share 2 of my favorite analytic biases: confirmation bias and optimism bias, right? Confirmation bias, right? We pay more attention to things that confirm our prior beliefs, and we discount information that is contrary to those beliefs. That is largely the story of Iraq WMD. Yes, collection failure, really an analytic failure. And when you look at the national intelligence estimate that was given to Congress before the war in 2002, every one of those major judgments was wrong. Every single one of them was wrong, and that stemmed in large part from confirmation bias, right? Optimism bias, close cousin of confirmation bias, right? We wish it to be, we hope this will be the outcome, therefore we predict it will be the outcome. Classic example that most people don't realize of optimism bias, which played out across the financial markets as well as business leaders and political leaders, Brexit. If you look at Brexit in the polls, which I did, 30-some polls in the run-up to Brexit, the Brexit referendum, all the polls showed it was within the margin of error, right? Whether the UK was going to leave or stay, all the polls were, a little, they were split almost down the middle, with a little bit ahead for leave, a little bit ahead for remain, and all within the margin of error. Brexit should not have been a surprise, but it was. The betting markets had 88% estimation that the UK would remain, right? And they were wrong, because business leaders had optimism bias of what they wanted the outcome to be, and that clouded their assessment of what the likely outcome would be. So in the Korean War, optimism bias is a dominant explanation for why the United States was so surprised when the Chinese entered the war, even though there were dozens of reports showing hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops massing along the border before they actually crossed over into North Korea. So I would add to that optimism bias, and I mentioned this a bit in the foreign affairs piece, discontinuous change. Identifying indicators of discontinuous change, I think, is one of the most important and underanalyzed areas of intelligence analysis and the possibility of failure. So how do we know it's different this time than what happened before? That's partly the story of Pearl Harbor. Lots of warnings that Japan was going to attack before December the 7th. What was different this time? Why is there discontinuous change? There were indicators when looking back in retrospect that it was different, the preparations before the actual attack. I suspect that's going to be a big part of the story with October the 7th for you. What did Israeli intelligence identify what's the difference between an exercise and a preparation for something more. The US is facing this right now in the Taiwan Strait, with China's ramping up its regular exercise activities to encircle Taiwan, to invade Taiwan airspace, its territorial waters, its exclusive economic zone. How do we know the difference between an exercise and the real thing? It's getting harder and harder, right? How to anticipate discontinuous change. Then the last basket of sources of enduring sources of intelligence failure, and this is the story of the US, organizational maladaptation, the inability of intelligence agencies to adapt fast enough to a changing threat landscape. Let me just end with a little bit on technology, which is the focus of my current work. It's not just the threat actors that are changing. The easier part of challenges for, at least for US intelligence now, is the great power competition with China and Russia. That's hard, but we have seen this movie before. What's new is the technology overlay in that competition. And that's, I'm sure, affecting Israel as well. Emerging technologies, and it's not just AI, and it's not just quantum, and it's not just internet connectivity, and it's not just the commercial satellite revolution, which is transforming the ability of non-governmental organizations to collect and analyze intelligence. It's that all of these technologies are converging at the same time. And they are dramatically challenging the intelligence business. And I'll just end by saying this is the talk that I'm doing a lot of work with the US intelligence community now about what does this mean? What do new technologies mean for intelligence today? And what I've been saying to them is I call them the 5 mores. If you look at the convergence of emerging technologies, they're creating 5 key challenges for intelligence. More threats, pretty obvious, right? Cyber threats in particular. More speed at which decision and intelligence has to operate. More data, so, right, drowning in data as a result of these new technologies. More customers who need intelligence who don't work in the government and don't have security clearances. So customers for intelligence today include business leaders, right? Include tech leaders, include voters who don't have security clearances. And so for intelligence agencies, it means committing an unnatural act, which is producing for a more open environment and dealing with customers who don't have security clearances. And then the 5th more, and I think perhaps the most transformational more competitors. Intelligence isn't just for government spy agencies anymore, right? And we can talk about that. And there are lots of examples about the open source revolution and the risks that it brings and the rewards that it could bring. And I spent a lot of time looking at nuclear risk assessment and the open source community. And I'll just stop there because I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. So we'll open this to questions for discussion. So if you have a question, you're free to raise your hand or just
I have a question. Where's the hand here? I have a question.
The option
You
to raise
mentioned
your virtual hand.
My virtual hand is my hand.
Or
A real hand. You pointed that those 5 issues that you look at the main reasons for failures of this kind. We used to ask ourselves also about knowing the culture of the enemy. To what extent this has played a role in the cases you have looked at? And I'm sure it has a role for us here, but if you can refer to that.
Yeah, so the mirror imaging problem, plays a huge role in US intelligence failures. So assuming the adversary operates and thinks like we do has been a persistent challenge. And I'll give you 2 historical examples of that. One was the India's 1998 nuclear test. Came as such a surprise to the US intelligence community that we learned about it in a press release, right? They didn't warn, they didn't anticipate it at all. Why? Well, at least the best research from an independent bipartisan commission, the Jeremiah Commission, found that intelligence analysts assumed that the campaign promises of India's party that came to power, saying that they were going to pursue a nuclear weapons test, they assumed that was just campaign talk, like in the United States, and they didn't take it very seriously. So that was one of the reasons, like assuming that politics in India, because it's a democracy, operated like politics in the United States, and people just make promises that they don't intend to follow through on, was the same. So that led to the surprise announcement of India's test. And then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I always joke that as a political scientist, you can't have any talk without referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis at least once, right? So, but in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a lot of mirror imaging. Khrushchev would never dare place missiles in Cuba because, of course, he would know that was too risky a move. And of course, he would know how the United States would respond. Well, in fact, Khrushchev made a very different calculation, and we didn't anticipate enough the pressure on him for the deployment of allied nuclear weapons close to the Soviet Union and what that did to his mindset. So mirror imaging is an enduring challenge, I think, and explains a lot of analytic failures.
Thank you. So Inbal and then Avnel.
Hi, sorry, I'm in the middle of things. First of all, thank you. That was really brilliant and interesting. I'm wondering if you have any insight about what we actually do about it. Especially I'm wondering about what you called, I think,
Oh, Inbal, we just lost you.
You're on mute.
Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah. Like, what do we do with the fact that there are always indications that something might happen? You called it something about continuity, but it could also be called, the problem of crying wolf. Like, what do we do about knowing that this time it's for real?
So I think that gets to indicators and warning. The indicators and warning have to be updated, and they have to be updated in a continuous way, because otherwise you're going to miss it. So you have to identify them ahead of time, right? And then you've got to make sure that you're stress testing your assumptions and your indicators and warning in a continuous way. So, CIA, after the Iraq WMD failure, instituted a red team. And the red team has been very helpful. And it's not just any red team, because you can imagine when you institute a red team that you could send, the worst people, because it could be a career dead ender, right? So one of the key things with the red team was it started with some of the strongest people, right? And so when it came time for the bin Laden operation, right, and the estimates of that the pacer was actually bin Laden ranged from 40% to 95%, same intelligence, right? Same intelligence, different people had different probability estimates. Red team went through it and scrubbed every assessment. How do we know? Can we be sure? And basically came up with the same range or similar range, like lots of uncertainty there. You're going to have to make a call. So I think there's some specific things that you can do. It's the tempo of how often you revisit your indicators and warning. Do you stress test your assumptions? Do you have devices to make sure that you're being creative about what indicators and warning would lead you to believe it's different this time? And I think, I think it's going to get harder and harder, especially as we think about, how the speed at which adversaries are adapting, right, to what the good guys are doing.
Thank you. Next, we have Avner and then Ofer. And I would ask you if you can briefly just present yourself also for the sake of the group name. Avner.
Okay, Amy, thank you so much for the presentation. I just want to refer to your fifth point, and then I will come to my answer to my question. You spoke about the open source and intelligence in business and so on. I just would like to ask you. I wonder if you heard about my book. We Never Expected That, which was published in Lexington Books last year. and it's a comparative study of intelligence failures in national intelligence and in business intelligence. And if you never heard about it, so it's an opportunity for me to remind you about it, and which actually deals with a few of the points that you just mentioned. And so this is just for your attention. Now about my question. I don't know if you heard about this book, but now you have brought.
I have, and now I'm going to read it for sure. So thank you for putting it at the top of my reading list. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to ask you about the function of the Director of National Intelligence in the U.S., which is one of the lessons after 9/11. How much as you may know, we don't have somebody in that position in Israel. How much you think that what is has the DNI have improved something of importance? Is it after more than 20 years, do you feel that it is needed? How much is crucial for the improvement of the performance of the US intelligence? I think it's after so many years, you can ask yourself how much this is really have done what the commission of the 9/11 have thought that it will happen.
Yeah.
If I may add a two finger to that, because it's a very similar question to what I had in mind. The public oversight on intelligence community, we know it's very different in the US than in Israel. You only referred in one point to organizational problems. So where oversight might actually help, I think, might help with others as well, but perhaps with this one. So how do you assess the efficacy of public oversight over intelligence matters in the US? So
sure. So I'll take those two, and then I would love to hear your all's perspective about those same issues. Do you think Israel needs an equivalent of a DNI? Do you think oversight is a problem? And if so, how to address it? So I'll trade you on that. Okay, so on the DNI, I will be very straightforward. I thought the DNI was a bad idea whose time had come. And by that, I mean, whenever there's an intelligence failure, the natural reaction is do something big. And politically, doing something big looks like creating a new organization. And so if you look at as if you believe as I do that the principal challenge in American intelligence is coordination, the last thing you want to do is create more organizations to coordinate, right? And so, however, I will say this about, well, let me go on about the DNI. The CIA never had the ability to actually run the entire intelligence community. So, and the story of the CIA was it was hobbled from its creation, did not have budgetary authority, did not have personnel authority, did not have enough authority to get all the organizations in the Pentagon to actually work as a unified team. And so for half a century, the CIA really struggled with that mission. And then we recreated the same thing with the DNI in 2004. Didn't have sufficient budget authority, didn't have sufficient personnel authority. Why? Because existing intelligence agencies made sure to hobble it, right? This is the politics of creation of new organizations in the US Congress. Existing agencies are going to lose power if there's a central coordinator. And so they sought out with their allies to weaken those powers from the beginning. And that's what they did. So the DNI has struggled, as the CIA director did for 50 years before that position. But the DNI has been more effective than I thought it would be. And it's been more effective in two ways in particular. One is it's provided sort of a punching bag when things go wrong. There's someone above the agency heads to kind of take it from Congress and the executive branch, and that's been helpful. So it gives air cover for then the individual agencies to keep doing what they're doing because the DNI sort of has their back. The second thing I think that's been very effective, and with the DNI, is NCTC. the National Counterterrorism Center. I know I'm sure there's a lot of coordination with NCTC and your intelligence agencies. And NCTC did coordinate things across the intelligence community in a very strategic way. And that is still the case today. And I think Christy Abizaid, the director of NCTC, is doing a really remarkable job. So I was pleasantly surprised by those two features of the DNI. Now, what will happen 20 years from now? I mean, what you see is CIA is still first among equals, right? So it's DNI and CIA. CIA does the lion's share of the work for the president's daily brief, for advising the president. And you can see the coordination challenges every year there's an annual threat assessment hearing before Congress. And it's not one person in charge, it's a whole table full of intelligence leaders. And so it's an ongoing challenge. Oversight. The least reformed part of the US intelligence system 20 years after 9/11 is Congress. Oversight is fundamentally challenged. I think most observers look at how it goes up and down over time. I look at it as it's always actually been pretty weak. And there are structural reasons why congressional oversight of intelligence is always so weak. So I think it's unlikely to change. The structural reasons are voters don't care about intelligence. Nobody votes for their member of Congress based on how they oversee intelligence. There's no geographic constituency that focuses on intelligence. So people in Iowa care about farming. And so anyone who represents the state of Iowa better be an expert on farming. There's no incentive for members of Congress to become experts in intelligence, right? Their voters don't care. They don't get rewarded for it. And in fact, Congress has mechanisms in the House to kick them off the Intelligence Committee just when they know what they're doing. So it is structurally designed to help members of Congress get reelected. And that is not what you want when it comes to good intelligence oversight. So there are structural reasons why I think oversight will always lag in Congress, but those reasons, it's always better in the Senate than the House. So it's a pretty depressing story when you look at congressional oversight. I don't think it's going to get much better. And I think it's a crucial failing because when you look at the intelligence agencies in a democracy have to have the trust of the people. And the organization, at least in the US, that can instill that trust best are members of the congressional oversight committees that can say, I heard the classified briefing, and I can assure you that these agencies are operating within the bounds of the law, in accord with American values, and in accord with the priorities of the national interest. And they don't do that enough. So I'm going to turn it over to you all and help me understand more about Israel's intelligence system and whether you need a DNI equivalent.
Yeah, so maybe I'll ask Ofer to quickly respond to that and trade you with his answer. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute for the Research Methodology of Intelligence, and he was also an assistant to the Prime Minister, assistant on intelligence to the Prime Minister. So Ofer, maybe if you'd like to.
Thank you very much. Very shortly, before I'm eager to ask my question, but first of all, thank you very much. I think your words were very stimulating and opening, mind-opening. I do believe we need a DNI and we need an oversight. I mean, we need not necessarily a new organization as a DNI, but some kind of a really strong integrated management of the IC, of the Israeli IC, which we don't have, we almost completely lacking it today. And we need it for so many reasons, you know, for systematic, systematically tackling tradecraft, which is, with regards to the question I'm about to ask you, to make sure we don't have unnecessarily overlapping, or where we do need an overlapping, to make sure we don't fall, nothing falls, you know, on the floor and we lose it. And also we need oversight because there is no transparency and no external critical thinking about Israeli intelligence. So very shortly, this is my quick answer. Now, regarding the question I have in mind is, I'm dealing in the last year and a half, together with OFIC and the institution, with what we call the academization of intelligence studies in Israel, saying that we have, well, I think we have very good training in the internal training of the IC, but we need systematically doing it, and also we need education. But I wonder if some of the lessons learned from the surprises you learned, is there any lessons learned or best practices regarding the tradecraft? So is it just something we think it's good to have, but or whether you can really make the difference between good tradecraft and not a good tradecraft, whether it's some kind of training or education, system thinking, SATs, learning humanities. So what venues should be explored in order to better improve our capabilities, tradecraft, from this perspective of tradecraft?
Well, thanks for the information and for the question. On tradecraft, SATs I know are very popular in the US IC. I do think there's room for improvement always in tradecraft. And so I was on a National Academies panel to look at how to improve intelligence analysis with some people from inside the IC, many people from outside the IC. And one of the things that came out of it was Philip Tetlock's expert judgment work. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And, Tetlock has found some pretty interesting things about what makes a super forecaster, right? And for those of you who aren't familiar with his work, he's done the greatest longitudinal study of prediction of specific things. So he doesn't take big strategic issues like the intelligence community would, but he takes specific questions like, what do you think the price of oil will be next week? Or what do you think the odds are that Mexico will invade Texas next week? Things like that. And he actually calculates whether people were right or wrong. And he's done this over 20 years with thousands and thousands of people. And what he's found is there's a category of people called super forecasters who are much better at it than other people. What makes a super forecaster a super forecaster? It's not their level of education. It's not their background. So it's not that people who have quantitative backgrounds or liberal arts backgrounds do better. The single greatest variable that makes a super forecaster is open-mindedness, right? The ability to update your assessment based on new information. And he calls it having dragonfly eyes. Dragonflies, I guess, have lots and lots of eyes. They can see things from multiple perspectives. So typically, right, what intelligence agencies do is they think, well, to get multiple perspectives, we need multiple people. That's one way to mitigate analytic bias. But the best analysts have this open-minded perspective. And Phil's now doing work, can you train people to have more of a dragonfly perspective? And his training, so far, he's found, yes, you can. So some people love his work in the intelligence community, some people hate his work in the intelligence community, but I think it's a really interesting line of research. If you haven't looked at it, it's worth looking into. I wanted to do with Phil, and we did not get far with this proposal, an analytic Olympics. So let's put people from different backgrounds, let's put people with access to the classified material, and let's have them compete with open source, people who only have access to unclassified materials. Let's go head to head. Let's see what's going to win. And actually, Phil did this for part of his work in this narrow area, and his super forecasters did better than everybody. Did better than the analysts inside the IC, did better than other expert teams. But I'd like to do it directly with open source, because that competition is then going to yield insight about how to improve tradecraft.
Thank you. So now we have Shai, Shira, and Udi. So Shai, please. You're on mute.
Amy, let me start by thanking you for taking the time to meet with us. I'm also a fan. I read your book, and I quote it quite extensively in my book, which also deals with emerging technologies and national security. I'm a Virginia Tech professor, soon to join Georgetown. and a former intelligence practitioner. And I wanted to double click on one of the things that you mentioned around the systemic collection gap. And I'd love to get your take on my question. So basically, based on my experience and my research, only seldom strategic surprises are caused because of lack of information. And we see that time and time again in pretty much every strategic surprise, including Israel and the States and in other cases, from Barbarossa onward. I think that maybe the problem is how to contextualize the information and how to interpret it, rather than the fact that we don't have enough information. That intelligence organizations usually use the lack of information or lack of enough sensors and so forth as a justification for them being surprised, or a justification for getting more budgets. Give me some money, I'll get better sensors, I will prevent eventually the next surprise. That let's put it aside, because that to me is part of the politicization of intelligence. But my question to you is, should we see the fact that there's simply, to some questions, there's no information, because nobody knows the answer to the question, how adamant are the Russian troops? What is the level of corruption? I don't think even the Russians themselves could know that. So I would distinguish between quantitative parameters or quantitative information and qualitative information. I've seen it, by the way, in my work in the political risk domain. And my question to you is, should we just accept the fact that when it comes to qualitative information, we will never know the true picture of reality, simply because there is no such picture? It's always contextual, it's always relative to the observer and so forth.
So thank you for that. I actually would distinguish between two types of qualitative information. I don't think it's as hopeless as and we can arm wrestle if you disagree with me. I don't think it's as hopeless as how you paint the picture. Absolutely, intentions, we don't know our own intentions, right? So I think if you put it, I would put intentions, adversary intentions in that bucket of, we may never know, because, what does Putin, what are he may not know until that morning, right? But then there's a whole basket of other qualitative squishy factors that you can get some fidelity about. Levels of corruption, they're indicators of corruption, right? Are things not working as they are? Do people have access to wealth that wouldn't make sense? You can infer corruption from objective indicators, right? You can imagine SIGINT that is telling you, I'm going to bribe you tomorrow, right? So I think you could get real hard and fast intelligence that would indicate corruption. So not every qualitative factor is hopeless. I think intentions are much more, if you look at it as a spectrum, I would think intentions are at one end of the spectrum, really unlikely to get a clear picture. But other types of qualitative variables like will to fight. This is an ongoing discussion about Taiwan, for example, as you know, like what's Taiwan's will to fight versus Ukraine's will to fight? Well, unwillingness to serve in the military is a pretty good indicator of will to fight, right? How many people are trying to get excused from military service? How much trouble have they had getting compulsory service? That's a very good indicator of will to fight, for example. So I think it's more of a spectrum than that.
Thank you.
Sheila?
Yeah, thank you for your fascinating take. It was really interesting. I really liked and thinking about your black and white swans example, which I think I can agree with it. I still think that I don't think that the October 7th attack was kind of like a black swan to Israel. I totally agree. I do think still, and I'm trying to get your opinion maybe about this part, that we did have, a big lack of imagination component. So we didn't even think or imagined the scale of the invasion, maybe the courage or the way they carried it out. And I think, from the I don't know, a very few, the information that we have right now, we still don't know. But I heard that even in our exercises before, and the way we try to imagine the scenarios, the possible or the probable scenarios, it was never there. So I'm trying to, just to think how we can say, okay, it is a white swan. But basically, and in fact, we never even considered, thought, or imagined the scale and the way they carried out this invasion. So I'm like thinking about what are the best ways or the thinking, tools to close this gap.
So it's a really interesting point. If we think about how can we disaggregate then in a more useful way, the black swan, white swan distinction, strikes me there are three components, right? One is who's the adversary? Do you know it or not? In this case, October 7th, yes. In September 11th, no. Do we understand their intention, right? In the case of October 7th, the answer is yes. In the case of 9/11, the answer is no. And then the third piece is, do we understand the capability? And it's the capability piece that you're pointing to, which it sounds like was not obviously not anticipated. And so if we separate into those three, that capability piece to me fits more under a, wow, that should have been, there's imagination within understanding capability too. It's not just imagination of the nature of the threat and the intention. It's imagination about what the capabilities could be.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking about like the different components that they used, with the drones and the glide divers and all those different small components that we knew on each one of those, but we didn't really think or imagined, just the combining of everything together and the impact of such fatal attack.
And I'm curious to know, and I don't want to put you on the spot, other people can jump in, this question of technology. So one of the things I wondered about was Israel too reliant on high technology, and did that end up becoming more of a hindrance in intelligence than a help?
No doubt about it.
Yeah, and I'd love to just jump in with one comment about it. I think on the other side, like the democratization maybe of technology regarding Hamas was also a big surprise for us, that this is maybe more about the capability component, that you can totally just buy this amount of tools, different, of course, tools and weapons and such, and carry out this, the scale of invasion. And I think that another point, which is not about intelligence, but still it's about intentions, and if you know your adversary, that we didn't imagine, is all the gender-based violence that we experienced. So it's not like an intelligence agency's, mainstream thinking, but this is a huge part that we experience now, and it was carried out as a tool of a battlefield. And
in the attack, you mean gender-based violence, and that was new?
This is new and unprecedented, totally.
Landscape, yeah.
Thank you.
Woody, would you?
Yeah,
also,
can you hear me?
You have a question, probably comment on that.
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, because it indicates as if it's mute. So thank you, Amy, for coming. I'm Ehud Eran, a teacher at the University of Haifa and also a fellow at the Institute and a practitioner also in my past. I was just about to ask about what you just talked about technology. You mentioned, the way you framed it, there are technological changes and the intelligence agencies have to adapt to them. We do, I think some of us at least intuitively sense that there is another problem of over-reliance on technology. Not only the direct effect that you only rely on these types of sensors, but also secondary effects like because technology is so cool, the better people go to these areas, and then strategic intelligence, which is softer, gets weakened. So I guess my question is, first of all, do you see this as a problem, over-reliance? Because in your description, it was more adaptation to technology. And secondly, how do you balance the two? How do you balance the need to adapt to technology and the risks it poses by over-relying on it?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I think if I just focus on AI, I say that at least in the US intelligence world, we have two kinds of AI problems. not enough AI, and too much AI. Right? But I do mean that there's a class of problems that we don't have enough. So inflows of data, too much data, not enough insight. It's not enough. We're not just looking at needles and haystacks. The haystacks have insights themselves, putting haystacks together with haystacks. And we are not where we need to be able to harness those insights. So that's the not enough AI challenge. What's the too much AI challenge? I think, to your point, like there's a distorting effect. I don't know if you're having these conversations, but here I hear a lot, let's sprinkle some AI on that. It's like the magic fairy dust, let's put on and make everything much better. And AI is good at some things, but it's not good at everything. So if the future looks different than the past, AI is not going to help you very much. AI is going to be very good at helping to anticipate a future based on the training data from the past. And so over-reliance on AI will distort your collection and analysis and actually lead to more blind spots for discontinuous change, right? If the future is going to look different in a discontinuous way from what we've seen before, AI is going to lead you in the wrong direction. But because it's sexy and it's high tech and it's big data, there's a real rush to put some AI on everything. So I worry about both of those challenges. I don't know if you all have a different perspective of how you're thinking about the same sets of issues. I'd be curious to know what you all think.
Can I quickly comment, Ofak? Look, generally, Amy, I agree with the over-reliance on advanced technologies, but I also think that it's tempting to look for someone to blame. Same thing happened post Second Lebanon War, following the investigation committee that basically accused generals for conducting warfare through screens. This neo-Luddite approach is risky. I think that, let's take the Martin Heidegger's analogy of a hammer, right? If you're a carpenter and you build a chair and the chair cracks down because somebody sat on it, you wouldn't accuse the hammer, right? You would basically argue that that's the carpenter's misuse of their tools. So while it is very tempting to accuse or to blame technology, I think that primarily technology is an enabler for human cognition and human decision making and so forth. And I think maybe the problem is not the over-reliance on technology, but false expectations. Both in the and I love that how you framed it, that the U.S. community either lacks AI or suffers from overload of AI. And I think same goes with the expectations of decision makers. From either they don't know what to expect, or they have overconfidence in the technology's ability to support decision making.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, to what extent do you think that our wrong impression of the capabilities of our own forces has an impact on false early warning situations?
So, again, I would love to hear what you all have to say about that in the current context. What really struck me about what you're going through and the lessons for the United States are, I think, U.S. intelligence agencies tend to underestimate how American actions influence the adversary. They're so focused on the adversary and what's going on over there that we often have a blind spot analytically to the interaction of the two. And I think the case in point that comes to mind for me is our horrific withdrawal from Afghanistan. So intelligence assessments were predicated on certain things happening. And I don't think they were understanding. I haven't seen them. Let me just preface this by saying everything I'm telling you is based on unclassified information. I have it's not based on any kind of special access I have to the government. So I'm speaking as an independent academic in the unclassified domain, which I'm sure you know, but it's worth emphasizing. My read on what's been publicly reported about the withdrawal was that intelligence assessments did not then say, if we leave Bagram Air Base, this is going to hasten the downfall of the regime with these potential consequences. That's sort of problem number one. Problem number two was you don't want to grade your own homework, right? So defense intelligence assessments were grading their own homework. Big surprise, CIA did a better job than other agencies at anticipating the potential negative downsides of the withdrawal. So I think that's a big problem in terms of how is what we're doing affecting what our adversary is doing. I think it's especially acute with technology. So American intelligence agencies collect abroad, right? They don't, with the exception of the FBI, they don't collect at home. How do you conduct technical net assessments? Who's ahead and who's behind in synthetic biology, in AI, in large language models, in fill in the blank? So we have an office in the Pentagon that does who's ahead or behind in fighter jets, sophisticated tanks, hypersonics, for example. We don't have, from an intelligence perspective, the ability to conduct net assessments of emerging technologies that are dual use. And that is a tremendous blind spot, I think, excuse me, with it for economic implications and geopolitical implications. So the how is what we're doing affecting our adversary is even more acute in the technology sphere and will be more of a problem tomorrow than it is today.
I would like to jump in with a question. So I study the public use of intelligence. And in the current context, we always talk about that the cost is, I mean, we all talk about today about the awards and the advantages, but we are also aware of the costs and the risk to sources and methods, et cetera. And today I'm contemplating the consequences of that to the ability to produce early warning. Israel was systematically revealing intelligence in the past few years as a matter of sustaining its previous strategy, let's say, of postponing the future conflict, et cetera. And I was wondering, perhaps from your perspective, looking at U.S. intelligence in this high-profile campaign against vis-a-vis Russia, do you think this has perhaps any consequences to U.S. ability to detect or to say something about China today, if there's any learning competition there? And you referred to this challenge today, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I know Director Burns and Director Haynes, so our DNI Haynes and CI Director Burns have talked publicly about how they've had a risk-reward sort of gain-loss analysis before they decide what to release. So there is a process that they went through that I think has become more regularized in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, which was novel for the intelligence community to help ascertain, like, what's the risk, what's the reward of releasing this information. So that's sort of one part of it, is there has to be a process in place to adjudicate those things, because you have to assume, you are taking a risk that some of your sources and methods will, you can put people in harm's way and you can lose your collection streams. And they made that calculation in a systematic way. Two things that are intriguing to me. One is the use of open source intelligence to kind of whitewash classified information that governments want to get out into the world while protecting their own sources and methods. So I'll give you my candidate for this. I don't know that this is what happened, but I suspect it may have happened. The discovery of Chinese ICBM missile silos, hundreds of ICBM missile silos, by non-proliferation researchers. Jeffrey Lewis, my colleague down in Monterey here in California, was one of them. Did they stumble across those ICBM missile silos, or did someone say, hey, look over here with your commercial satellites? It was very convenient for the open source community to have discovered these missile silos and to have it be front page news, so the US intelligence community didn't have to do anything about it. I don't know that that's what happened, but you can imagine that that would be a very useful way to harness the open source community. Second example that I'm really thinking about is the declassification of intelligence related to tactical nuclear use. So you'll note that there were news stories showing that the intelligence community declassified very sensitive conversations among Russian generals about actually discussing using a nuclear weapon in the war on Ukraine. Pretty sensitive. What happened after that was declassified? Well, you see that Xi Jinping actually spoke publicly, warning about no use of battlefield nuclear weapons. So this intelligence diplomacy, I think, is a new tool of statecraft that Director Burns is using. And I don't think it's a coincidence. It's him, because he is a career diplomat and he thinks of intelligence in a different way, that you can gain advantage by revealing, not just by concealing. And so I think this is a new approach.
I think it's an interesting equivalent to Netanyahu, perhaps. Maybe his diplomatic background has something to do with that. Ofer and Stephen, please, do we have, Amy, do we have?
We got 3 minutes left, so maybe we can take questions and then we can wrap up.
Maybe let's take Wagner's question. I already spoke.
Okay, thanks.
So the comment in the question, I guess, we were talking about net assessment a little bit earlier. Stephen Wagner, Brunel University in London. Net assessment is not strictly an intelligence function. The figuring out the other side, of course, is, but it is not the IC's job to figure out your own will and your own capability. One is a political question, and the other is kind of ops and planning. So turning this back into a question is, how do we remedy this problem that things intelligence get, net assessment questions end up, and failures that have to do with them end up getting put upon intelligence? Where do we organize this discussion? In what kind of body? Is this a National Security Council sort of thing? How would you present that?
Well, this is a great question to end on, because I wanted to bring this back to what role you can play. So the intelligence community, you're absolutely right, isn't really well suited to doing that net assessment. In addition to the fact that it hasn't been historically their job, there are real concerns about civil liberties and collecting about, collecting on American companies, for example, collecting on American technologies and venture capitalists, et cetera. So you can imagine there are really good reasons why you might not want to give that to the intelligence community. What role can academics play? Well, universities have a very good sense of situational awareness of what technologies are on the horizon, of who's doing what, of who's ahead and who's behind. Who are the leading AI researchers in LLMs in the world? Universities know who they are. So I think the open source community includes academic researchers like us. And the question is, what role should we play? Not just in analyzing what intelligence agencies do, but in helping them in what they do and providing capabilities they can't or shouldn't be providing themselves. So I don't think it's just that we stand on the sidelines and then look after the fact at what went wrong. I think there's a really interesting role for academic researchers to play. And I'll end with, so one of the reasons I just 2 days ago had a big workshop. We launched something called the Stanford Emerging Technology Review. It is a university-wide effort in 10 emerging technology areas led by science and engineering faculty to look at what are these technologies, what are recent developments, what are over the horizon issues, and to provide that to decision makers, all unclassified, right? People in Washington, people in the IC, people in the private sector community, to in part to fill this gap, because our government can't do it itself. And so I think, we'll see how it goes. We're just launched it for the first time. But there's, I think, real interest among the US government in enlisting universities to do that more. Now, the challenge organizationally is, where's the node of engagement in the government? And so as I briefed Avril Haines, I said, if we're producing, who's receiving? Where's the belly button in the government that's going to interact with academics and outsiders in specific areas to be able to bring that intelligence, that information in, to be able to utilize it. So that's the problem that I see now, right now, is what's the node of engagement for all sorts of open source intelligence within the government? Because open source at the end of the day isn't just data, it's not just stuff, it's a community. They're organizations. And so the challenge isn't just how can I buy me some more data, it's how can I harness the wisdom of organizations from the outside to do things that I can't do myself inside the government.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much for this discussion. I was really happy that we were able to really engage in discussion, even though it's through Zoom. But when things settle down, perhaps we can have you here in person.
That would, I would love that. I hope we get to an end of this war that is a sustainable peace for Israel, and we can all meet together in happier times. I would be really interested in what you all decide to do as a community in terms of analyzing this intelligence failure and how you're moving forward. And if I can be helpful or you want to continue the conversation, let me know.
Thank
Think
you.
of a role for you. So, thank you very much. Really, it was really
Thank you. And thank
illuminating.
you all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you. It's good seeing
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you again on December 18th. I will send you the invitation. Follow us on Twitter. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sofek.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.